All right, welcome everyone. My name is Matthew Schmaltz, and I'm the executive editor, and founder of the Journal of Global Catholicism. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Hansol Gu, who is an assistant professor of liturgical theology at the School of Theology and Seminary at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota. She teaches and researches in sacramental theology, global Catholicism, theology of migration, and theology of art and architecture. She earned her PhD in theology from the University of Notre Dame in the USA and a baccalaureate and licentiate degree in history and cultural heritage of the Church from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, and a bachelor's in fine arts degree from Columbus College of Art and Design in Ohio. Her doctoral dissertation is entitled Migrant God, Anamnesis and Migrant Sacramentality for Korean American Catholics. So, Dr. Hansol Gu, welcome.
Thank you.
So, already with my brief introduction, it's clear that you have a very interesting intellectual background. Could you share with us some of your intellectual journey?
Yeah, so my intellectual journey really begins in Rome. I went to Rome in 2012. Yeah, 2012. Around the time um, I was working as a graphic designer actually in Paris, and
Oh,
going through a huge change in my life. And I had already always studied art and fine art and graphic design, and I always worked in the art field.
mm,
But I had an experience of a reversion of faith. So I came back to the church, and that coincided
mm,
with my interest in art. So I decided to go to Rome to further my studies. And so I studied a licentiate degree in history and cultural heritage of the Catholic Church. So the program was basically art history, um, uh, architecture, monuments, archives, museums, and anything that has to do with cultural products of the Catholic Church.
mm,
It's a very historical sort of program. So we studied from ancient to contemporary, anything that has to do with like artistic activities of 2000 years. But
wonderful.
during the studies of my licentiate degree, my questions grew more theological as
Mm,
opposed to historical. So I was less interested in, you know, historical development of an artistic movement, for example, or a biographical information of an artist, but more about, how do people experience God through art? What leads to that experience? What happens with that experience? And what is so powerful about image, about visual, about art that can really kind of have this powerful religious experience. Um, and so I realized that experiencing God through art actually meant that the viewer, the individual who is experiencing God and looking at the artwork, is actually a deeper understanding of who they are. So
mm,
I was very fascinated by this um, sort of a dialogical, experience between the human person and God through artwork, but then the experience of God allowing the human person to become more authentic self.
mm,
So that led to working on the licentiate thesis on Benedict the 16th. And so I became increasingly interested in theological questions, and I realized that my interest in art was actually um, at the bottom of my questions. Um, my interest was actually an experience, like a sacramental experience of the material culture.
mm.
So I decided to pursue that further in my doctoral studies. So I came to Notre Dame to pursue my PhD degree.
Oh, fantastic. So, I want to talk us to talk about global Catholicism, but I'm so interested in the work that you've done on Benedict the 16th
Yeah.
and his understanding of beauty in particular. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So Benedict 16th on beauty, my project was kind of a constructive one.
Mm,
He wrote a lot about everything, as we know. Um, and I saw sort of a consistent thread that was going through on many of the theological texts that he wrote,
Mm,
including his text on liturgy. And my question at the time, this was at the Greg, was the role of sacred art in liturgy. We know that from the magistral documents that sacred art is at the service of the liturgy. And so therefore, art serves the purpose of bringing the human person in encounter with God.
mm,
Um, Yet, as we know, art today, contemporary art in liturgy is quite, contentious. There's a lot of
yes.
split opinions on what sacred art should look like and what it should do in the
Mm,
liturgical context. So I looked towards Benedict XVI and his idea of beauty because I wanted to learn about how can we understand beauty from a theologian who has a very sort of consistent view on many aspects of the life of the church. And so Benedict XVI, he's concerned about beauty because he's very pastoral.
yeah.
He understands that in the contemporary society, beauty is critical in giving hope to the human being, to the people of today, today's society, of healing, of sanctification. So he's very much concerned with beauty, but he also recognizes that beauty is a confusing topic, especially in the contemporary society. So he talks about the event at Auschwitz, the event of Holocaust, and after that point, we can no longer rely on this classical understanding of beauty as, this kind of like perfection, this sort of otherworldly type of beauty, because
Mm,
that type of truth no longer works because we have seen what human beings can do, what evil human beings are capable of. Um, so, uh, Benedict XVI is very much Augustinian. So he
yeah.
realizes that a human person's experience of beauty is something that pierces the heart of the of a person
Hmm.
and leaves a person with desire. And
Hmm.
so, it's so the person, will um, always long for to seeking this experience of beauty. And so beauty is something that is objective, and there's a human desire that longs for that beauty. And but what's really kind of interesting to me about Benedict the 16th is that he doesn't stop there, but because he also realizes that um, Augustinian view of God is not this, like I said, otherworldly, transcendent God, but God is experienced in history, right?
Right.
So beauty also is something that has to have that human and historical dimension. Um,
Mm,
so so that's the constructive part. My own contribution to studies on Benedict is that if you look at his corpus,
mm,
that consistent thread throughout his theology, and try to understand what he means by beauty in light of that thread, we start to understand that for Benedict, beauty is both transcendent and also immanent. Um, Beauty lies in the truthful beauty that he talks about is actually seen on the cross. Of course, he was
yes.
very much influenced by von Balthasar and the truth of God, the love of God revealed at crucifixion.
Mm,
So so there is really kind of this complex um, idea of beauty that is not that is transcendent and therefore urges the human person to desire for this beauty, but also it's in the human suffering, as we have seen on the cross, that is almost kind of a prerequisite for experiencing the truth of God. Um, through that suffering. So uh, his idea of beauty, in essence, is
Mm.
a redemptive beauty. So
Well, okay.
yeah,
A really wonderful way to put it. So now moving toward to your work on global Catholicism,
yeah.
can you talk a little bit about your research into Korean American Catholicism and the kinds of issues and themes that are particularly important for Korean Americans who are Catholic?
Yeah, so the background for that research actually, well, the aim of that research was the theological understanding of anamnesis.
Mhm.
I studied liturgical theology and sacramental theology at Notre Dame for my doctorate work. And so the questions I was answering is when we participate in the Eucharist, we are celebrating and encountering God in memory of the Lord. So the anamnesis is not just a moment of do this in memory of me, but it's the entire liturgy. Um,
Mhm.
entire liturgy remembers the life, death, and resurrection of the Lord. And but the question is, uh, what are we remembering, first of all, when we say they remember? Um, and what are the effects of that memory, that remembrance? And what does it mean that we participate in the Eucharist through memory? The modern sort of understanding of memory is something, psychological.
Right.
It's like a picture that you pull out from the back of your mind, when you want to
Mhm.
remember something. But theological understanding of memory, anamnesis it's closer to a biblical understanding of memory. So I was asking these questions, and I thought that a good way to understand um, that sacramentality of memory in liturgy is to look at the experience of migration.
Yeah.
And so I turned to Korean American Catholic communities in the US as a case study, and then asked the same questions. When they remember in liturgical celebrations, what are they remembering? How do they remember? Also, what are the things that they remember versus what are the things that they forget? Because memory is selective.
Oh,
And
interesting.
yeah, and what are the reasons for what could be the reasons behind that selective memory? And what are the effects of uh, you know, remembering their Korean cultural and historical heritage?
Hmm.
When we look at the way that immigrants remember, where they came from, their
Yeah.
family members, what they have maybe left behind, there's something very sacramental about it. And that sacramentality is not only just in, somebody's mind, but it's in the material things, the
Hmm.
family photos, food recipes, the food that your, grandparents used to make. Of course, language. And so there's something very sacramental about the way that immigrants remember in the diaspora, that is unique to that diaspora because of that experience of immigration. They're removed from their homeland. There's something about that distance from the homeland that allows them to remember and enter into that um, reality that is in their past.
Hmm.
I think that is quite unique. Um, Korean American Catholics, Simon Kim, who is a Korean American theologian, Catholic theologian, he coined the term the Korean American Catholics are minority of minorities.
Hmm.
So I mean, there were few Koreans in the US since the beginning of the 1900s, but the real kind of, substantial immigration history for Koreans start in, the mid-century, mid 20th century. So they've been around in the US for, 50, 70 years now, but very little is known about them. Um, and so I wanted to tell their story. In many ways, the way that they're experiencing generational transition, their experience of what it means to live as immigrant communities in the U.S. is very similar to other minority communities. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of
Hmm.
comparing and contrasting the different experiences of different communities. Um, and they're really sort of at crossroads right now. the first generation of Koreans are transitioning, they're passing, and second
Hmm.
and third generation are looking for their identity and ways to be American, but also be Korean and
Hmm.
Catholic in the
Right.
US. So they're a, yeah, interesting case.
So you talk a little more about that. I mean, what kinds of themes or practices characterize Korean American Catholicism?
Yeah, so for me, Korean American Catholicism, um, the diaspora setting is very important.
Hmm.
That removal from the homeland, and for Koreans, Korean Catholics in America, what happened in the home country while they were in the US is very important as a context,
Okay.
because Korea from 1950 to 2000 and now as well, the country has seen a tremendous change in terms of, economics, international politics, their culture. So it's a tiny country that has seen such a huge change that the people in the diaspora could only watch from afar. So
Hmm.
the Korea that they left behind when they moved to the US is no longer the Korea today. So there is this, it's like it's the distance both in terms of geography, but also time and also,
Hmm.
awareness and recognition of what it means to be Korean anymore. So Korean Americans are very interesting in that sense. I think that their spirituality is also unique, and this
Mm.
is perhaps um, it should be set in the bigger context of Korean Catholicism in Korea.
Right.
When we study different minority communities in the US and their liturgical practices, um, eh, we tend to sort of, for example, if we think about practice of popular piety for different
Hmm.
minority communities, I think that Korean Americans present something that is quite different and unique in comparison to other Asian American communities, Latino communities. And so the for Korean Americans, their spirituality is more interior and more closer to Buddhism. It's very
Mm.
interreligious in that sense. So understanding that there are different spiritualities for minority communities in the US, I think that's very important. That not all Asian countries practice their Catholicism in the same way. Korean Catholicism is very
Right.
different than Vietnamese or Filipino, for example. So yeah,
Hmm. Okay, great. And I know that, I know personally that you teach global Catholicism, having
yeah,
been privileged to be a guest lecturer in one of your courses.
yes,
Can you talk about how you frame a course like that on global Catholicism, how you
yeah,
structure it, since there are innumerable ways in which a course on global Catholicism could be
yeah,
framed.
yeah. So the way that I teach global Catholicism, I tried to bring multiple perspectives,
Mm.
and but mainly focusing on historical, um, theological,
Hmm.
pastoral, and liturgical. So it
Okay.
seems like it's a lot, but
Yeah.
but you cannot understand what is happening within the Catholic Church around the globe without, if you leave one of them out, of the
Yeah.
picture, it's just impossible. So, you have to understand the historical experience of the people, history of colonialism, of trauma, of war, of exploitation, injustice, and also missionary activities, right? So you have to understand like how Catholicism was present in different parts of the world. History also includes today's reality for the Catholic Church, the fact that majority of Catholics are now um, in the global South, right? And so that history is very important. Theology is a lot of ecclesiology. How do we understand the relationship between, universal church and local churches, and is that really the right way to understand it?
Hmm.
Universality versus particularity. What does it mean to be a body of Christ? And also, so then what does that mean when we practice that faith? So, liturgical perspective, it's really kind of when you start to see examples of what people actually do when they
Yeah.
when they practice the faith, right? How do they celebrate mass? What language do they use? How do they sing? How do they dance? How do they help one another? How do they practice charity? It's when you encounter what people do that you are able to sort of put the two together. There's kind of a theological or historical framework in the context of what people are actually doing. So that's the liturgical ritual part. And spirituality, or no, but pastoral, I mentioned pastoral,
Yeah.
is so a lot of my students are lay students who are going into ministry.
Okay.
So, especially in the US and Canada, it's inevitable that they're going to minister to people from various backgrounds.
Hmm.
And so teaching at School of Theology at St. John's, our student body is very diverse. We have international students who are religious, from, priests and nuns from, Asia and Africa. But we also have domestic students, who come from all over the US, all different,
Hmm.
denominational background. And so for them to study global Catholicism in the Midwest, the benefits are great because for our domestic students, they get exposed to the fact that they realize the fact that their understanding of Catholicism is it's not just in their own backyard. It's not their immediate experience of the church. And even if you're not Catholic, understanding that the church is, global, um, is for some students, it's quite interesting. For our international students, they are able to see their experience of their church within the context of the US, within the context of the largest. So the benefits are really on both sides. Our
Hmm.
international students are able to um, voice their experience of their Catholicism back home, for example, and so it creates such an interesting um, you know experience of dialogue and discussions and understanding and mutual learning. Yeah.
Yeah, well put. Um, Before I let you go, I was just really fascinated by the work that you're doing on Michel de Certeau.
Yeah.
One of my favorite theorists, coming from a more ethnographic anthropological side. And I just want to
Yeah.
know what drew you to Michel de Certeau and what you've learned about his theological vision.
So Deserto, I came across Deserto, I think for the first time in an interview with Pope Francis, of
Yeah.
Pope Francis with Antonio Spadaro in the American magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And um, and so I started reading Deserto. First, I think I read his, the book that everybody reads, that is the practice of the everyday life.
Sure.
And I was very fascinated by the way that he is really able to pay attention to just the trivial moments in life
Mm-hmm.
and understand that that's where reality happens. He
Mm-hmm.
one of my favorite text of Deserto, and this is not in that book, but he talks about New York City, right?
Yeah,
And there's different view of the city from the skyscraper,
you're right.
has a different understanding of the city versus the people who are walking on the street. And he has this photo that he took of two women just passing each other on the street. They're not looking at each other, they're just, passing. And he points out that he's able to pay attention. He sees that when two um, bodies pass, it creates this tension. So if you're
Mm,
walking together in a parallel, there's no tension there, right? But when you cross, there's a tension, in that sort of contradiction.
right.
He's very, he's all about contradiction, right? So
Hmm.
it's in that contradiction that, the reality actually happens. And I just love that idea. And so I started reading more of his theology.
Right.
He was an editor of what is it, Christus, I think it was a magazine for
Right.
a long time,
Hmm.
and so he wrote a lot of theology, in that journal, and he, of course, comes from the Ignatian spirituality, and so um, his understanding of Christianity in the postmodern context, where experience of reality is
Hmm.
fragmented and subjective, um,
Right.
subjective, losing words. And he's very concerned about this, and
Hmm.
so he's asking, how can we conceive of Christianity in this postmodern, post-Christian world?
Right.
And while some people might fear post-modernity and
Hmm.
uh, how can the survival of Christianity in this context, Michel de Certeau is actually quite brave and says that the fragmented reality is actually an advantage for Christianity, because the nature of Christianity was never it was never this kind of a place of stability. And I'm sure you
Okay.
understand, when de Certeau says stability, um,
Right.
it's actually a disadvantage to be in a
Hmm.
stable, fixed place, because new life is actually formed in decentralized, destabilized, um, this space of freedom.
Right.
So his theology is really kind of, centered on the empty tomb of Christ.
Hmm.
It's that um, it, Christ had to die and resurrect in order for the Spirit to come. And
Right.
so it's the empty tomb of Christ that allowed the subsequent history of Christianity to happen. And so for him, it's actually an advantage for Christianity today that we live in this kind of like fragmented world, um, because it means that there is going to be new form and new Christianity, new way of being Christian communities that that is it's inevitable that that the new kind of reality will form. So
Oh, wonderful. So final question, about your future work. What are your plans?
yeah, so I have many ideas and many plans, but
Yeah, we all do.
for me, it's right now at least, it's really kind of three things.
Okay.
Um, One is Korean Catholicism.
Hmm.
Now that I've started my study on Korean Catholicism from the immigration context, from
Right.
an American context, but I want to go deeper into the roots of Korean Catholicism and try to figure out continuity between Catholicism in Korea and Catholicism in Korean America.
Ah.
So I want to continue my work on that. Um, my question really is, it always has to do with a sacramental encounter between God and human. And I think that what I'm really interested in now is um, uh, the this tradition of spirituality and fruitful sort of dialogue between spirituality and sacramental theology. And by spirituality, I mean specifically mysticism. And I think
Oh.
that would really kind of bring about the two almost speak the same language.
Hmm.
Mystical, presence of God and sacramental presence of God. And
Yes.
so I'm very much interested in that world. And then another thing is, my kind of ongoing interest in art and aesthetics.
Yeah.
Sacramentality of art is always, interesting to me. So I'm continuing my work on that. So three big topics. Not enough
Very
time.
big topics, very big topics. Well, thank you so much
Oh, you're
for
welcome. My pleasure.
being with us this afternoon and for all your contributions to the Journal of Global Catholicism.
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Okay, great. Thank you.